Hey folks, all right, let's try to wrap up this discussion of these four thinkers from the progressive era. So we've got Emma Goldman, we've got Eugene Debs, we've got Herbert Crowley, and we've got John Dewey. Thomas Dewey, another famous Dewey, Republican politician in the 20th century. Anyway, okay. So let's start with Goldman. So we've already talked, so this is on the Emma Goldman and the Anarchist Alternative. It looks like slide 9 in the progressive slide pack. So we saw that for Du Bois, he increasingly moves into a socialist, communist or socialist worldview as he ages, and eventually he sees capitalism really as the main problem. Racism obviously is a big factor, but it's through a class analysis that he sort of shapes his understanding in his later life. Now, with Emma Goldman, we see a similar focus on capitalism as the real problem for America. Now, she's going to take a version of socialism that is an anti-statist version of socialism, and so she will be we can consider her an anarchist socialist. She's absolutely, she considers herself an anarchist, but it's part of the left-wing tradition of anarchism. There is a kind of right-wing tradition of, at least contemporary folks will talk about a kind of right-wing version of kind of libertarian anarchism. Anarchism in its origins is absolutely not that, and it's absolutely a left-wing phenomenon. In its origins, it's a splinter from the labor movement, splinter off of the anti-capitalist socialist labor movement. So that's where Goldman is coming from. So she's a Russian emigre, comes to the United States, and she's going to fashion really an American version of anarchism that has some links to some of the traditions of anarchism in Russia, and there are a number of important, really two of the most important anarchists, foundational anarchists, Mikhail Bakunin and Pyotr Kropotkin, she is indebted to, but she kind of molds this in partly in the context of her new country. So the piece that we're reading from her, she talks about really the three enemies. It's not just capitalism, but it's religion, property, and the state. And it is a kind of unholy trinity and relationship between these three that she considers to be really the root of all problems in the United States, but not just in the United States. I mean, this is a wider analysis that says these are basically the three obstacles to human freedom, and that the control that these three exert over human life is oppressive, and that it's the tyranny of the rule of these three and the way that they function together that needs to be the target for human emancipation. So, along with socialists, she will say capitalist property is theft. So capitalism takes from workers, exploits workers by forcing them into unequal bargaining conditions in which they agree, quote unquote, to give over some of their labor in return for wages, but they are never able, because of a fundamentally unequal bargaining position, they are never able, and by the way, Adam Smith, this is not in her piece, but Adam Smith, foundational author, kind of defender of capitalism, at least is claimed to be a basic defender of capitalism, dating back to his work, The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Even Smith notes exactly this kind of thing that Goldman and other anarchists and socialists will really center their philosophy around. But even someone like Adam Smith will note there is always a fundamental inequality and hierarchy between business owners or factory owners and the workers, that the business owners are always able to combine and collaborate because there are fewer of them. It is easier for them to make decisions together, and because they have more power already, it is easier for them to combine and function as a unit, whereas the workers are always bargaining basically as individuals. Of course, later there will be efforts to unionize workers in the 19th century, but basically because it is always easy for the combined forces of capital to act as a unit, whereas they're acting and making contracts, supposedly free contracts, with workers as individuals. Those workers are always fundamentally disempowered. Smith doesn't think it's as much of a problem as obviously the later socialists, but again, this is just a basic feature that early capitalist economists are uniform in saying, yes, that's just the way things work. Okay, so this leads to an exploitative dynamic where essentially, from Goldman's standpoint, and again, this echoes much of Marxist, political and economic thought, essentially what we have is theft. I should say it's also not just Marxist thought. So Pierre Proudhon was an early socialist in the early 19th century, and he has a famous work called Property is Theft. And it's not about how like your scissors or your clothes are theft. It's about property as private property, folks owning workplaces, that is a kind of theft. So this is something that that Goldman agrees with, and the idea is so that something is actually being stolen from you when you're forced to bargain in unequal conditions. The thing that you were forced to give over, that is the surplus value of your labor that you are not able to control, but that the factory owner is able to extract from you by getting you to work for low wages, which means that the larger part of value that you create, you're not actually able to bargain for. So you essentially give away that. That is thievery, that is theft for Goldman. And so, so there she's with the socialists. Where she's against the socialists, and where much of her criticism will also be directed against various kinds of Marxist socialists, is that she thinks it's wrong to try to use the state, the coercive machinery of the state, the police, the army, or even forcible coercion exercised through the law. Even those things, she thinks, are troublesome and problematic, even if used by a kind of left-wing government, especially if that government, seizes power in a kind of revolutionary Marxist transformation. So the problem is, so you have this problem of capitalism as exploitation, but relying on the state, which is essentially a violent, coercive apparatus, is not the means to achieve human emancipation, because it's using an improper means to address the fundamental problem. So the state is essentially not just responsible for crime, but is the actual criminal in Goldman's story. It is the thing that creates a system, in conjunction, of course, with capitalism and religion, but it is the basic enforcer of a system that takes misdirected energy for the people who are having their labor exploited and stolen from them. It takes their misdirected energy and then claims that this is criminal. Like, think of something like the drug trade. I mean, that's not something that she would have been talking about, but if you think about the way that the economy for illegal drugs has functioned across the latter part of the 20th century and even into the 21st century, this is all misdirected energy that the state is then criminalizing, and that is a form of violence that the state is exercising. And it's the state to blame for that. It is not the fault of individuals who are trying to make do the best as they can. It is not their fault. And sometimes this results in them engaging in violent crime too. And Goldman is not an apologist for, Mexican cartel, gangsters shooting each other. That's not, that is also not her world. But just in thinking about it, it's not like she's trying to say, every single instance of, let's say, murder is necessarily the state's fault. But overall, the idea is that most crime is basically a product not of human nature, but of the systemically bad laws that privilege the few over the many and that force the many to try to make do as best they can. And that means they wind up in quote unquote criminal behavior, but it's the state that's the actual criminal. Okay, go to the next slide. So Goldman thinks about what it is to be an individual, and it's to be a person. So who are we trying to free? What is the point of human freedom, of human emancipation? Well, it's freeing individuals in their creativity to engage in loving relations with those around them. Now, not romantic love, but in a kind of artistic, aesthetic relationship to the world around them, to their fellow human beings, toward objects of creativity, to the way that they might express themselves in terms of their labor. So this is especially denied to women, she says, even if they were supposedly to be given the vote under conditions of capitalism. Their essential creativity is still what is being prevented from preventing from having a true outlet if they are in the position of being a worker, a wage laborer in a capitalist economy. So the path forward is to try to have, to create the conditions for social harmony between free associations of individuals. So it's not about a top-down controlled government order, but it's about you could link this to the Jeffersonian tradition in the United States. It's about individuals who really, truly, freely come together, which means they're not being dominated by the ideology of religion. It means that they're not under control of the kind of false freedom of the workplace in a capitalist economy, and the state is not there then to coerce them through its violent laws. So this is the path toward the future. And it is opposed to the kind of false order that government that government proposes through its systems, basically, of prisons. Coercive laws, prisons, these don't actually deter anyone. They just create more and more pathways and pipelines into a kind of prison industrial complex. It's not a term that she uses, but I think she would certainly endorse that idea of a prison industrial complex. And so the thing to do for anarchists is direct action. So voting is not the way to go. It's not, maybe vote, maybe not, but it's not really the primary thing for her. It's strikes, labor actions, open resistance, even sometimes in cases of severe oppression, she endorses the idea of the kind of slave rebellion that John Brown was trying to begin in 1859. So it isn't that she is always everywhere a proponent of outright violence, but certainly strident resistance that is conflictual and that sometimes won't shy away from violence if need be. And she herself had a kind of somewhat more checkered past in which she and her paramour had engaged in an attempted act of I guess you could call it anarchist violence, in which they attempted to assassinate, and her partner specifically, they were doing this together, attempted to assassinate an industrialist. I think it was Henry Clay Frick. So she had taken that much more direct kind of path of political assassination. That is not what she's endorsing in this text, and that was something that specific version she had come to repudiate. That was actually something that was much more common in the Russian context. And so in her earlier phases, she was a little bit more in the kind of anarchist terrorist mode, but that was something that she later repudiated. But that doesn't take away from the fact, I offer that as a bit of context to say that she was not to be messed around with. But in her later work, she certainly was thinking more about kind of mass strike actions as the kind of preferred modality, but for a real assertion of the working class against capital and against the state. Okay, now let's turn to the next slide to Eugene Debs, who was the most important American socialist, not anarchist, but more in the mainstream tradition of Marxist-inflected socialism. And Debs was so he's the founder of the Socialist Party in the U.S. He's a firm supporter of the IWW, which was a major international working class association. So very influential across many countries. In the late 1800s and early 1900s. He even runs for president twice, one time from prison. It's not like he comes close to winning, but he does have pretty substantial support, at least in one of his elections. So he was a major force in American politics for quite a number of years. I've already talked a little bit about the idea of exploitation and the way that capitalism works by profiting off of what Marxists think of as surplus value. So there's the value that you are creating, and there's a surplus of that the capitalist is able to grasp through bargaining, through unequal bargaining conditions, is able to take that, and that surplus value becomes their profit, but it's actually value that was generated by the worker. But unlike Goldman, he is happy to endorse some forms of a state. He thinks some form of a state, although a working class, a state that is dominated by the working class rather than a state that's dominated by the capitalist class, is absolutely justified. So he is not an anarchist. He is not averse to state power in the way that she is. So one of the things that we see him talking about in this essay is the importance of a broader form of working class solidarity. What we had seen, what Americans had seen in the latter part of the 18th, again, I keep saying 18th century, latter part of the 1800s, was that you did have these various unions that were arising, but the unions, and so they were rising and strike actions and what have you, and lobbying to try to restrain capitalist power in the workplace. But the issue was that these